In this series, we're looking at the pieces of Panzerblitz unit by unit. In this, the second installment, we're going to take a look at the anti-tank guns in the game and how to use them well here today on Legendary Tactics. But first, a quick word from this video's sponsor. The anti-tank guns in Panzerblitz are quite tricky to use. Historically, they usually had the advantages of concealment and of having a low profile, which meant that they could be a nasty surprise for the enemy. But in this game, one's opponent can never be surprised by them, and so can attack them when they have the strength to do so, or generally bypass them otherwise. Realistically, the Russians, who are always on the offensive in Panzerblitz, will need to use their anti-tank guns in creative ways, many of which arguably are actually defensive in nature. They can count as a unit that crosses the victory line to help win the game, which is an offensive use. They can help in a defensive-offensive way to guard the flanks of an exposed attacking force. They can also be used to infiltrate the enemy line using either trucks or half-tracks, and subsequently used in some sort of delaying action or simply to help surround and contain targets that have been bypassed by the main attacking force. Let's take a look at all the ones that are available. We'll start with the Russian 45mm gun, which is the weakest anti-tank gun in the game. With an attack factor of 7, it can potentially do some damage to light vehicles and maybe manage 1-to-1 odds against a tank, but the major challenge is its range. A range factor of 3 in a game where vehicular movement is typically between 8 to 16 is not going to be very effective regardless of the attack factor. And it will find it tough to deal with approaching enemy infantry, as it is an A-type weapon. And although it has a decent defense factor of 3, it's not enough to hold up against most attacks. It can potentially help to channel enemy units, especially things like trucks or recon vehicles that may be forced to go around them when pressed for time. However, the issue is getting the weapons into position offensively, as they are usually trailing well behind the tip of the spear. Best case scenario, expect this anti-tank gun to occasionally cause a dispersal when using a selective attack, slowing down the enemy a bit and buying you time, unless it is shooting at weaker units. Though it's probably not a loss worth crying over, unless the anti-tank unit is backed up with infantry, heavier artillery, or some transportation to whisk it out of danger, it is likely to be destroyed at the hands of infantry who are close assaulting, or by an AFV that has nothing else useful to shoot at. It is best to place these units in the woods along a useful road or likely path of the enemy, not alone in a town hex, as this greatly increases its vulnerability to tank attack. Generally speaking, placing them on a hilltop will also be fairly useless, as their range may not even extend all the way down the slope in some cases. Next, we have the German 50mm anti-tank gun. This has a decent attack factor, which can do some damage against lighter vehicles, and in most normal attacks has a 50-50 chance of dispersal of a heavier AFV when close. But it is hampered as well by its range, which limits its usage to the enemy that's pretty much right on top of it. And it doesn't stand a chance against infantry, which is likely to destroy it with close assault tactics. The best use of these guns is similar to the Russian 45mm gun described earlier, in wood hexes along pathways likely to be used by your opponent to disrupt and channelize enemy movement. For all intents and purposes, everything that was said about the German 50mm can be applied to the Russian 57mm, which is almost identical. Then we have the Russian 76.2mm anti-tank gun. Finally, we have a weapon with some teeth, which can do some damage if given the chance. Most times it should be able to manage at least the dispersal of an enemy tank. It has a terrible defense factor though, and its limited range means that it will either be used at targets at the furthest end of its range, just as the enemy heaves into sight, or when the enemy is one hex away and is just about to overrun their position. With normal luck, though, one can expect to cause some dispersals. These are great candidates for placement in forts or surrounded by mines or blocks to keep them alive as long as possible. Losing them isn't the end of the world, but they do represent an appreciable loss of firepower if eliminated. Depending on the layout of the board, these can be great when placed in the woods, on hilltops, or even on level ground. A nifty combination can be in conjunction with a lesser value anti-tank gun that can stop and spot the enemy, while the heavier anti-tank gun behind gets at least one good shot. Once again, everything said about the 76.2mm can also be said about the German 75mm, as both anti-tank guns are essentially identical in game terms. Finally, we get to the best anti-tank gun in the game, the famous German 88mm. This weapon is blessed with both a long range and a high attack factor. While it has a terrible defense factor, this, in practice, is not a lot worse than other anti-tank guns in the game. It's best to use the long range to your advantage, like a boxer with great reach. Just make sure to load up and move out when the enemy gets too close, find another good defensive position, and continue to punch the enemy at a distance. They're best deployed in the woods or towns, preferably on a hilltop, wherever you can get the longest possible field of fire. The expectation is that this weapon will destroy armored units at close range and disperse them at longer distances. With a range of 20 hexes, it forces the enemy to maneuver carefully, even in their rear positions, and take cover where possible. And don't be afraid to fire your 88 at any target worth shooting at, including infantry. It has a decent chance to disperse infantry up to 20 hexes away, and in a game where time is of the essence, this can be a big deal. As with any of the aforementioned anti-tank guns, infantry are generally the biggest threat though. Keep a half-track nearby for transportation and evacuate the position anytime a mass of tanks threatens or if there's a lot of infantry approaching in vehicles. You don't want to lose an 88 if you can avoid it, even just to avoid the blow to your morale. And these are the anti-tank guns featured in the game Panzerblitz. We hope you got some value out of this video, and if you did, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe down below, and we will see you here next time on Legendary Tactics.